when he was about 50 yards away, the plane exploded and blew him about 300 feet into a drainage ditch, and he was paralyzed for a short time, and he lost hearing for a while. And he finally came around, and it was okay, thankfully. And he said, after that, anything I do in baseball was great. It's just happy to be alive, needless to say. And he came back actually in time for the 1945, the end of the 1945 season. There was a big hullabaloo. Hank's back, finally we have a great player back. And sure enough, he homered in his first game back with Detroit. The last game of the season, he hit a home run to put his team into the World Series. And during the World Series, he hit a grand slam that basically won the last World War II championship pennant, or title, I should say, for Detroit. Basically, it was an unbelievable showing by Hank. And pretty much his last hurrah. 1946, he didn't play nearly as well, at least for the first few months. He was in a terrible slump. And then one day they went to Boston. The Tigers went to Boston. One of his teammates, bit of a loose cannon, snuck into the Red Sox clubhouse and stole one of Ted Williams' bats. He said, "Here, Hank, Ted's doing pretty well. Why don't you go ahead and use this one?" They said, "Okay, I'll give it a try." And sure enough, he started clubbing the ball left and right out of the yard, and actually wound up passing Williams in home runs and RBIs that season, denying Ted the Triple Crown that he really wanted badly. And when the two of them met at the end of the season, they had a ceremony, and Hank kind of ceremoniously gave him the bat back. Ted said, "Yeah, thanks." Turned away. Otherwise, though, it was pretty much the end of the line for Hank in Detroit. Even despite that great last little drive, the salary drive, they didn't want anything more to do with him. And there were a lot of cries of anti-Semitism, and how could you possibly get rid of Hank Greenberg? He's this great hero in Detroit. Had turned the page on him already. Hank, of course, landed on his feet, though. He went to Pittsburgh and signed a contract there. And during the offseason, he married Carol Gimbel, who was the heiress to the Gimbel department store fortune. So he became an instant millionaire and had the last laugh, as any good Jew might. In terms of ball players, great ball players who actually saw a lot of combat, probably none saw more than Bob Feller, whom I recognize there, obviously in the Navy. He too signed up right after Pearl Harbor. I think his exact quote was, "We're at war and we're losing. They need my help. I'm going to do whatever I can." Like most players, he was offered the chance to have kind of a cushy physical training job. He could have stayed stateside and not seen any action, but he refused that and said, "Put me where the fire is." So he was a gunnery officer on the USS Alabama, a battleship in the Pacific that saw action in just about any conflict in the islands you could think of. He was there. His job as gunnery officer was basically to spot incoming enemy aircraft and direct fire toward that. Obviously a job pretty quick-witted and the steel nerve. And he was very proud after the war of the fact that not a single sailor on the Alabama was ever killed by enemy aircraft fire. So that was a testament to how well he did his job. They also played some baseball during the war when he could. The Alabama would pull up and weigh anchor at some nameless, faceless atoll in the middle of nowhere. And they would all hop off and throw down sacks of flour or whatever, their sailor hats, whatever he used as bases. And Bob Feller would trot out there in his dress shoes and pitch a game against the neighboring ship. It was pretty amazing. He said after the war, once you face that kind of action, enemy action, and face combat, pitching in Yankee Stadium doesn't really seem like it's all that nerve-wracking. And he proved that. It wasn't nerve-wracking at all in early 1946 when he came to Yankee Stadium and threw a no-hitter against the Yankees and got his post-war service, post-war career off to a flying start. He actually set the record in 1946, single-season strikeout record, 363. The Indians, who played for Cleveland, were not very good. They'd been bought mid-season by Bill Veeck, who you might recognize his name. A minority owner in the team actually as well as Bob Hope. So that's sort of an interesting tidbit. And they came to him in the middle of the season and said, "Listen, Bob, you got a lot of strikeouts. If you go after the record and come anywhere near it, we'll cut you in on the gate of all these extra fans who come out to see you chase the record." And Bob liked the change, so he said, "Yeah, I'm into that." So he basically pitched every day down the stretch and wound up breaking that record on the last day of the season. Unfortunately, he kind of threw his arm out in the process and was really never the same. 1946 was his last great season. But of course, he's still a Hall of Famer, and that was probably his most memorable moment. And then there's this guy, you might recognize him. Jackie Robinson, of course, might be familiar with his movie, of recent vintage. He had a fascinating story. Of course, 1947 was his first year in the major leagues with Brooklyn, but 1946 was his first year in professional baseball. White folks ball, as they called it in the Negro leagues. And And the fact that he was the first man to break the racial barrier was in large part due to World War II. And the coincidence that happened, he was signed up in 1942 and was sent down to Camp Hood, Fort Hood, I should say, in Texas. And there was a racial incident there, as you may be familiar with. He was asked to move to the back of a military bus, refused. Racial epithets were exchanged, and at the end, he was court-martialed for the episode. And it was a ridiculous case, and he got off. But the entire episode naturally soured him on the Army and the people in it. So while his unit was shipped overseas and wound up fighting in Europe against the Nazis, Jackie was not with them. Jackie was home in 1945 playing Negro League Baseball with the Kansas City Monarchs, thus available to be seen by Brooklyn. Branch Rickey's chief scout, Clyde Seaforth, saw him and identified him as maybe not the best player who was around, but the most available player. He was here, and he could bring him in and really get a handle on what he could do, and of course what he could withstand, unfortunately. And so that's a main reason why Jackie was the one who wound up breaking the racial barrier, as I said. In 1946, he went down to Florida and was with the team in Daytona, and obviously Florida was a Jim Crow, strangled by Jim Crow at the time, and he went through quite a bit, and inured him to what he would then have to go through with Brooklyn at the big club. In a lot of ways, it was a lot easier when he broke the major league color line because he was in Brooklyn and people were a little bit more, there was a lot more light on him. There wasn't nearly as much, kind of PR reasons to go after him in public, such public. In Florida in 1946 during spring training was a lot worse for him. He would go out to play and the local town sheriff would come out and say, sorry, you're not allowed to play night games here, even though it would be bright sunlight. Lock the gate and send everybody home. Or just tell them flat out, you can't play with African-American players on the field. It was that kind of atmosphere that he played in. And when he went to Montreal, it was a lot different. Montreal really embraced him. They were, not necessarily less prejudiced, but they treated him as much more of a curiosity, and he was their superstar. And he had a tremendous season. His very first game, April 18th, 1946, in Jersey City, against the Jersey City Giants, the New York Giants farm team. Jackie did rose to the occasion as only he could. He hit a home run in his very first game and went on to win the batting championship that year and lead his team to the Little World Series, what they call it, the AAA World Series, the championship that year. But it was tough on Jackie. He had a real hard time at various points during the season, despite how well he was playing. And at one point, he was actually on the verge of a nervous breakdown. And he went to a doctor, and the doctor said, listen, take a month off, relax, and then maybe at the end of the year you can go back and play. Jackie thought about it. He took a day off and went on a picnic with his pregnant wife, Rachel. And then after one day of rest, he went right back to it and did what Jackie Robinson did. Played great and went on, as I say, to win the World Series with his team. And there was a lot of people who wanted Brooklyn to call him up at the end of 1946 and come up and play down the stretch, because certainly Brooklyn needed him at the end of the year. And wiser heads fortunately said, you know what, he's been through enough for one season, let him have the off season. Cooler heads prevailed, and they said, all right, you can make your debut in 1947. At the end of 1946, his very last game in Montreal, they just won the series, and he was on his way off on a barnstorming tour the very next day. This is what ball players did back in those days to get some extra scratch, because of course they weren't paid very well. And the crowd, the field was covered with fans adoring him and slapping him on the back and trying to lift him up, and he fought his way to the clubhouse, and then he changed, and there's a car outside waiting for him, but he couldn't get to it because there were so many people waiting to love him. And finally, he just took off running down the street, chased by this huge throng of fans. And a sports writer who was there captured the moment by saying, it was the first time in history that a black man has been chased by a white mob with love and not lynching on its mind. That was basically what the attitude was toward Jackie in Montreal, much different than he had experienced in Florida. And of course, he would then go on to become the pillar of baseball that we all know and love. In 1946, there's a lot going on off the field as well. Probably the most important thing was the nascent union movement in baseball. Obviously, the players had so many of them had been fighting overseas for freedom, only to come home and realize they didn't really have any in their jobs. Players were tied to their team, what was called the reserve clause. They couldn't, obviously, be free agents. The team cut them at any time, sell them at any time. They didn't have any power over their movements. It was very much a one-way street, or basically indentured servants. This guy, Robert Murphy, was a labor lawyer in Boston, and he saw the the teams come through, and he used to ask them, why are you settling for that? It's ridiculous. Everybody else in the country is on strike for better conditions. Baseball players should be too. So he actually did something about it. He formed the American Baseball Guild, which was the first sort of labor movement ever in baseball history that had any kind of teeth. And he unfortunately overstepped just a little bit in June. This is him outside the Pittsburgh Pirates clubhouse. Pittsburgh, obviously a big union town. He said, I'm going to call a strike vote. We're going to put it to the owners to give us more, better conditions and things I want out of management. And unfortunately, they didn't get quite the number of votes they needed for that particular vote. And the players decided to play, and they all opened the door and ran past Robert Murphy and never to be talked to again. The American Baseball Guild kind of died in its crib that day. The management don't realize that they couldn't keep things the exact status quo the way it was. So they fought kind of a rearguard action all season and gave bits and pieces to the players. But they kept the real levers of power firmly in their hands. And then it would be that way for another generation or more, 30 years, until free agency as we know it in the 1970s finally came and players were finally granted freedom of movement. They could have had it a lot earlier had they been a little bit more bolder and listened to Robert Murphy, but unfortunately it didn't happen. So you had a kind of fascinating push-pull going on even as the game was being played on the field that year. And it was quite the amazing season. Of course, Boston, where Robert Murphy was based, they had two teams. The Braves were terrible, but the Red Sox were awesome. Most people thought that the Yankees, being the Yankees, would be the best team. But instead, Boston, led by, of course, Ted Williams on the far left there, had an unstoppable offense. And a couple of their other players are seen here who were very important. Next to Ted, that's Dominic Finaccio, Joe's little brother. They called him the Little Professor for reasons that should be obvious there. He was a very studious guy, but a great player, excellent hitter, and one of the best fielders in the entire league at center field. And then there was the beating heart of the team, the double play combination next to him. Bobby Doerr, the second baseman, and to the far right was Johnny Pesky. They called him the Stiletto for his profile. We'll be hearing more about Johnny in a minute, but these four really led an unstoppable attack in Boston, dominated the American League, ran away with it early, and were never threatened. They went to the World Series, but who they were going to play was very much in doubt right up until the end of the season. Everybody assumed St. Louis had the best team. They had Stan Musial, they had Country Slaughter, Venus Country Slaughter, and several other stars. But Brooklyn had this guy, the manager, Leo Durocher, seen here in his natural habitat, arguing with umpires. That basically was what Leo was all about. Combat, pure and simple on the field. He never backed down. Took the team by the scruff of its neck, basically, and hauled them almost to the brink of the World Series. He was really a pioneer in a lot of ways. He used his entire roster, his entire bullpen, all in one game. And they would come to him after and say, hey, Leo, what about tomorrow, man? What are you going to do with the players? He said, hey, it might rain tomorrow. My job is to win today. And that's how he approached life, basically, in baseball. He was famous that year. That summer, he was sitting, talking to some writers, and they looked across the field at the Giants manager, Mel Ott, and somebody said, hey, look at that Mel Ott. Isn't he a great guy? What a nice guy. And Leo sneered and said, nice guys finish last. That's pretty much what happened. That was his ethos. He instilled in his team, which really was not yet the Boys of Summer Dodgers that is now, of course, famous in song and stage. All the great players, obviously Jackie Robinson, the African-American players were not there yet. Several of the other stars, Duke Snider was not there, Carl Burrell was a rookie. Only Pee Wee Reese was really a regular, the guys whose names you might recognize. But the fact that Leo kind of kicked and screamed and spurred them on to this real intense effort put Brooklyn in a place where they could actually steal the pennant, the national pennant from St. Louis. They went neck and neck all the way down to the end of the season. And at the end, they wound up tied. It was the first time ever that two teams were tied. They said, all right, let's have the best of three to decide the playoff. Who's going to meet Boston in the World Series? So a coin was flipped, and Leo won, and he said, let's play the first game in St. Louis, and then the last two in Brooklyn, so on the home field advantage. He didn't factor in, though, that teams were still taking trains out to St. Louis in those days. The only team that flew, pioneered that year, were the Yankees. They flew road trips that year, and they soon, obviously, that became standard for all baseball. But most teams still took the train. St. Louis was there already. Brooklyn had to take a 24-hour train ride out to St. Louis, out west. Then played the game. They got off the train, stumbled to the ballpark, lost. Then everybody got back on the train, came 24 hours back to Brooklyn. They played again. Brooklyn lost again. And that was the season. St. Louis won. And if there had been a Manager of the Year award then, Leo would have easily won. They didn't have one yet, but he did a great job. But little could he imagine that that was actually his last full year as a Dodgers manager. The very next season, he was banned from baseball for the entire year for hanging out with gamblers mostly. He ran with a bad crowd. That year, in 1946, he made a lot of waves for seeing a married actress on the side and caused a lot of trouble with his very religious president of the team, Branch Rickey. And he had posted dice games in his apartment and was seen at the track all the time and hung out with unsavory characters. And it all ended up to the fact that the following season in spring training, he was banned from the game for the entire season, suspended. And then after that, in 1948, when he came back, he managed for a couple months and then jumped to the Brooklyn's arch rival, the New York Giants. He moved that it was so controversial and so hard to believe that there is no real modern precedent, really. I guess it would be like jumping from Boston to the Yankees in midseason, but it's much more hatred and poisonous than even that. So for the younger guys, ask your grandparents about what it was like between the Dodgers and the Giants. But it was an unbelievable move. But basically, that was it. Leo left Brooklyn after that season. In the middle of that season, I should say. This was really his high point, his swan song in Brooklyn. But he came up a little bit short. St. Louis won the World Series. They would play Boston. The problem with Boston was they'd been sitting around for a week waiting to see who was going to win this playoff between Brooklyn and St. Louis. And what do you do when you wait? It's kind of a classic question in sports. Do you kind of hang out and let your injuries heal and risk getting rusty, or do you want to keep playing and keep your edge? Well, the owner, Tom Yawkey of the Red Sox, and the management there decided, hey, we can make some money off this. Let's stage some exhibition games, get an all-star team in here, have them play the Red Sox, we'll make money, and we'll stay sharp. Win-win, right? Yeah, except it blew up in their faces in the very first inning of that very first all-star game when Ted Williams, the great Ted Williams, was hit by a pitch on his elbow, and it blew up to about 3 times its normal size, and he went limping out into the clubhouse, and the entire city of Boston went and turned white. And for good reason, because Ted wasn't the same player in the World Series after that. He only had 4 hits, 1 RBI, and was, a shadow of his great MVP self. And a lot of people afterwards said, you know what, maybe we shouldn't have exhibition games anymore, even the World Series, probably not a good idea. The series itself was built up, of course, as a showdown between the 2 great MVP players, Ted Williams against Stan Musial. As we said, Ted Williams unfortunately got injured and didn't have nearly the great series that he wanted to and that the fans of Boston thought he might. You can imagine what he would have thought afterward had he realized that would be his only appearance in the World Series ever, unfortunately for him. Stan Musial appeared in several prior to that. He didn't play great in those or in this one either particularly, but his name is thought of a little bit better historically in that sense because the Cardinals won. He had 3 World Series while he was there. And it's interesting between those 2 great players, Ted and Stan. At the time, contemporary thought was Stan was really the better player. Ted was a great hitter, but Stan could do more all the way around. And that's kind of changed long since they retired, after they retired. Why did it change? In a large part, Ted has been venerated more by the sheer, his activity in World War II, his veteran status and in Korea, of course. And as we've come to appreciate the people who fought in those wars more, Ted, by association, has become a bigger and better figure than he was at the time even, and has kind of surpassed Stan Musial in a lot of people's minds. Not necessarily because of what was going on in the field, but what happened off the field and since. It's an interesting sidelight that I get into in the book, a little bit more details. So you had the World Series, Boston against St. Louis. It went right down to the end, Game 7, 8th inning, tie game, 3 games apiece, 3 runs apiece. Country Slaughter leads off the bottom of the 8th for St. Louis. 2 men get out, and then who comes to the plate? Harry Walker, we last saw back in the Stadion de Hitlerjugend in Nuremberg, failing at a critical moment in that World Series. Here he is, 1 year later in the real World Series, back home, getting a chance to redeem himself. And sure enough, he did. He hits a base hit to the left center field, short left center field. Edith Slaughter on first base, then embarks on what's called the Mad Dash, one of the most famous moments of baseball history. He goes around second, around third, all the way home. Doesn't stop. His third base coach says, "Stop, don't go," and he runs right through the stop sign, catches everybody by surprise, especially Johnny Pesky, Boston shortstop, who gets the relay throw, looks around, hesitates just a split second, And in that split second, the curse of the Red Sox is pretty much born. Boston had never actually lost a World Series to that point. They had been undefeated in World Series play. However, this was the first time they lost because Johnny Pesky held the ball. It was only a split second, and he really probably would never have gotten Slaughter anyway. He was such a fast runner. And as you can see, the throw was nowhere close to home plate anyway, so he was nowhere near throwing him out. But after the game, everybody said, Johnny, why'd you hold the ball? And all his other teammates kind of backed away from, taking the blame for the rest of the series. And Johnny stepped up and said, yeah, it was all my fault. He caught me by surprise. I was shocked. I held the ball forever, et cetera, et cetera. And in the years since, as Boston found ways to blow championships in ever more painful fashion, Johnny, the pesky holding the ball moment really got blown up in the minds of baseball fans around Boston much more than it probably should have been. Had they won in 1948, 1967, 1975, 1986, etc., Johnny would have been off the hook. Instead, it took to the new century, and as a Yankee fan, I don't want to go any further, but Johnny finally, thankfully, he lived to see the Red Sox win in 2004 and was finally taken off the hook. But for a good half century, he was held, as I say in the book, some people there, and most people in Boston still regarded him as a piece of the leader because of that one single split-second moment in St. Louis in Game 7, Country Slaughter's mad dash. So the first ever post-war World Series champs were the Cardinals. Here's celebrating. That's Whitey Kurowski, the third baseman, is number 1. That's Country Slaughter, number 9. Good old country hardball. He used to play when he was growing up, barefoot in the fields of North Carolina. That's the kind of thing we're talking about here back in the day. Number 4 is Marty Marion from the great city of Atlanta, Georgia. They called him Slacks. He was about 6'4", maybe 110 pounds. They used to use him to get the balls out of Stewart Ring, as they call down there. And of course, number 6, Stan the Man. Stan Musial, taken off the hook. Afterward, of course, Ted Williams was a pariah in Boston for his poor performance. Stan didn't play much better, but nobody ever thought about it because the Cardinals win, and winning is everything. So, 1946, an incredible season, a victory season, and the Cardinals were the champs. But after that, their failure to sign African-American players, unlike Brooklyn, really doomed them to a generation of failure during the season. They didn't approach the World Series until they finally reversed course. It was thought that they're, where they were in the country, they had a large Ozark fan base and a southern and southwestern fan base. And it was thought by management that, our fans wouldn't want us to sign black players, basically. And that cost them badly on the field as Brooklyn signed several, and the New York Giants did, and both of those teams surpassed St. Louis. And finally, they said, you know what, we're idiots. Our fans are idiots. Let's go sign some great black players. And they did. Bob Gibson, Kirk Flood, Lou Brock, etc. And really, ever since then, St. Louis has been at the top of the heap in the National League. So there was a small moment there right afterward where they found themselves on the wrong side of history. Boston, much the same way, famously the last team to integrate, took them into the early 60s to finally sign a black player. But that was the victory season. That's all I have for you. I've been talking long enough. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Rob agreed to do some questions, and if we have time, anyone like to ask? Yes, please.
Well, I know that Hank Aaron broke Babe Ruth's record. Whose record did Babe Ruth break?
It was, I can see his face now. There's a blank on his name. Home run baseball.
I don't know who got it. Roger Connor.
Roger Connor. Thank you, guys.
Who was it?
Roger Connor.
Roger Connor. A career home run record.
There was no, home run records were nothing until Babe Ruth. Nobody cared about it. It didn't really exist in any way. I mean, people had to go back and look, basically, to decide, hey, wait a minute, he wrote this guy's record. Home runs, obviously, during the dead ball era were few and far between. Babe Ruth turned them into something, along with several rule changes and changes in the baseball itself that allowed, Babe totally changed the game altogether. This is the subject of my first book, by the way, in much more detail. I hadn't thought about it in a while, but obviously, as you say, when Hank Aaron came along and had something to chase, that was much more on the public's mind because home runs were everything in the game at that point. Within the first 50 years of baseball until 1920, home runs were not really anything that anybody thought about. It wasn't part of the game at all. Nobody hit the dead ball out of the park, so it was really not thought of it anyway.
Other questions for Rob? Oh, yes, sorry.
How many Jewish players are there in baseball today?
Today, how many? exact number, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 20. I mean, there's a fair amount, maybe a few less, 18, something like that. There's a couple of websites that keep track on a sort of day-to-day basis of all the stats and everything. You can check it out for the exact number. There was a recent card set, baseball card set, historically, not just current players. We could get 75, 80, something like that of Jewish players throughout history, you know, from Moses Solomon, the famous rabbi of SWAT, one of the greatest things of all time, through Hank Greenberg and Sandy Koufax, and Al Rosen, and then today we have, you know, Kevin Nicholas and Dave Campbell, players like that. So that's something I have no piece of that action, so I'm just recommending it because it's kind of cool, but you should check that out. That's a good way to keep track of how many Jews there are in the nation.
Was there much anti-Semitism in baseball in the early days?
Yeah, I mean, going, you know, depends what you consider the early days. You know, 1946 wasn't exactly early days anymore, but there was still plenty of anti-Semitism. Yeah, not so much, on the field, anti-Semitism was sort of always there and mostly accepted by the players to as best they could. You know, name calling and things like that were, you know, something that was pretty easily shrugged off. Certainly in the early days, a lot of players were changed their names or, you know, hid their identities as non-Jews to be able to play because they just were not accepted in many ways, especially in the Midwestern cities or the Western cities in those days, Cincinnati, Chicago, St. Louis. A little bit more tolerance, but as I alluded to earlier, you know, kind of baseball wasn't really it was a huge sport, you know, kind of nationally, but within the Jewish community, there was a tremendous amount of, you know, interest in becoming professional players. There weren't that many. Players, you know, managers and owners in the teens and 20s and 30s used to actively search out Jewish players because they knew that would increase the box office, especially in New York, Boston, Washington, northeastern Florida. And they just couldn't find that many. I mean, there just wasn't a huge amount of interest. And obviously that changed, as I talked about, once World War II came along and sort of phased out